Hey guys, Brad here from Scooter Street. Look, the subject of today's video is the best scooter engine to tune. Now, this is going to be particularly useful for you in the sense of setting expectations for the scooter that you might already have before you start tuning. It's also going to be really useful if you're looking for a project bike that you have an end goal in mind. That you can choose the right bike that's going to meet the expectation that you have, because there is a really drastic difference between different scooter models in terms of engine characteristics and what they're capable of. Now, this can be drastic in the sense that one bike might have a maximum power ability of 7 horsepower and another might have 70. It is that much of a difference when you're talking about 50cc two-stroke engines. Now, much of this comes down to two things. This is the engine characteristics of the engine that's in your model of scooter. Now, what I mean by this is how well does it respond to performance tuning. Now, the second thing that sort of ties into the first is what performance parts are available for it. Now, this is a really key factor. Now, an engine that responds really well to performance tuning, likewise, the performance manufacturers are going to focus the majority of their parts on that particular engine. Now, you might have one model of scooter that only has, say, two cylinder kits available for it in a particular brand, and then you have another model of scooter that has, say, 20 or more different models of cylinder kits, all the way up to really high racing cylinder kits for that engine. Now, this makes a really big difference when it comes down to what you're going to be able to get maximum power-wise, because obviously the more parts that are available for it, the more you can modify it. I do just want to preface as well, just because one particular model of engine might be better for tuning than another, doesn't mean that others are bad. Often the best scooter to tune is the one that you have, because the whole idea behind scooter tuning is it's supposed to be fun. Two-stroke 50cc engines are fun to tune. You can spend a small amount of money and get a really big performance increase, and they're so simple to work on. Now, to explain which scooter and which engine is best for tuning, I'm going to break down the different variations of engines and scooter models into 3 main categories. This is motor type, which is the brand or the manufacturer of the original base engine design. This is piston travel direction. This is vertical or horizontal. And then cooling method, which is usually either air or liquid cooling. Now, it may surprise you to know that virtually 99% of scooter engine models can be broken down into just 4 major engine types. This is the Honda engine, the Minarelli engine, the Marini engine, and the Piaggio Hyper 2 engine. Now, particularly when you go back sort of earlier than 2000, there are some other models. Piaggio has some other 50cc engine models that are older. Piaggio even made a 50cc manual engine and some of the really old Vespas. But for this one, we're going to be focusing just on those 4 major types. Now, you may think to yourself, well, hang on, I don't have a Honda, I have a Sim, or I have a Kymco. Well, the different scooter manufacturers have adapted and improved upon some of these base engine designs rather than designing the whole own engine from scratch. Now, to take that specific example, if you have a Sim or a Kymco, it's not actually a Sim or a Kymco base engine in that scooter. It's actually based on the old Honda engine. Because of this, many parts in many scooters are actually shared. The cylinder kit that may fit a Sim also fits a Honda, also fits a Kymco, because they're based on the same base engine. And the same is true with quite a number of the other engine models of the 4 different types. So I'm going to go through each of those engines one by one, and we're going to talk about some of the different variations that were available in those engines and how that pertains to tuning. We're going to start off with the Honda engine. Now, this is one of the original 50cc two-stroke scooter engine designs. It's one of the first to use a CVT, and it is a really great little engine. Very, very reliable, and very commonly does a really high number of Ks before needing a rebuild. Now, this engine was available in 2 different variants. This is the vertical and the horizontal engine. The vertical models tended to be used in the earlier iteration of the engine, and the horizontal was used in some of the later models. Now, horizontal versus vertical in a nutshell, some of the manufacturers started off with vertical engines and then went to horizontal engines later on. Now, this is primarily because the horizontal engines use gravity to their advantage. Now, in a vertical engine, the piston is continuously fighting gravity, moving upwards and downwards, whereas on a horizontal engine, this is not the case. Now, the other major factor is the vertical engines do tend to often suffer from excessive carbon buildup at the exhaust port. I'll explain this simply. In a two-stroke engine, you have intake ports on one side and an exhaust port on the other. And so the idea of the engine is to suck fresh air and fuel in and then exhaust that gas out the exhaust port. Now, in a vertical engine, The only thing pushing the exhaust gas out is the piston. So what does tend to happen is some of the carbon, particularly in a two-stroke engine, you have the two-stroke oil burning, which produces quite a bit of carbon buildup if it's not exhausted properly. It gets stuck around the exhaust port because there's not a whole lot pushing it down the exhaust. Now, in a horizontal engine, not only is it not fighting gravity with the piston direction, but gravity is actually helping push that, that carbon deposit and buildup out the exhaust rather than it wanting to hang around inside that exhaust port. Now, there is one other factor with vertical versus horizontal, and this is engine layout. On a horizontal engine, because the cylinder is facing forwards, going gun barrel straight ahead in the direction of travel of the scooter, this leaves quite a bit of space towards the back of the engine to mount things like your intake manifold, your carburetor, and it generally tends to be a much more efficient design to work around. On a vertical engine, however, because the cylinder is facing directly up into the sky, it makes it a little bit more difficult because you don't have room around the back of the engine the same as you do on a horizontal engine. It also means things like cylinder replacement and exhaust removal are a bit of a pain in a vertical engine because you often have to remove quite a bit more panel work to get to the cylinder and things like the exhaust header nuts than what you would on a horizontal engine, which is easily accessed often by removing the shroud just behind where your feet would sit. And for exhaust, it's very easy to access, usually straight through the bottom of the scooter. Now, the Honda engine itself, both in the vertical and the horizontal iteration, I would describe as probably a mild engine for tuning. So you'd probably be able to get really good performance out of either the vertical or the horizontal engine. The main thing with this engine is it's really tough, it's quite reliable, and it generally will do a lot of Ks. Particularly as it pertains to the crank, I don't know that I've ever seen a Honda engine crank fail. Even Honda engine crank bearings fail. They're really, really tough in the bottom end because they're designed to go for a long time. Now, when it comes to things like cylinder kits, exhausts, that sort of thing, there are quite a few options available because they've been around a really long time. But this is generally probably going to be an engine that you're going to have as a mild street setup, maybe somewhere in the range of 7 to 10 horsepower if you really tune it up well. It's not going to be an effective race scooter. It's not going to be something that you're going to be wheel standing around all over the place, unless you get maybe an older Honda, which is a really light chassis, like an old Elite or something like that. Still going to be a really fun scooter to tune, but it's not going to be one of your top-end performance models. One of the other things contributing to this engine probably being not a super high-performing engine is the fact that it was only ever available, to the best of my knowledge, in an air-cooled model. Now, air cooling versus liquid cooling, to put it in a nutshell, for performance, liquid cooling is far better. Now, other than the obvious liquid cooling is far more efficient, the other big factor with 50cc two-stroke engines is in an air-cooled engine, there's a large fan that runs directly off the crank that attaches to the flywheel, and this sucks in air and directs it around a heat shroud that sits around the actual cylinder itself and forces air through the fins of the cylinder to keep it cool. Now, the problem with this is that fan provides quite a lot of drag against the rotation of the engine, and because it's bolted directly to the crank, it's really sapping quite a bit of the energy out of the crank as it tries to make power. Now, particularly when it's trying to accelerate rapidly, it's trying to drag this fan along with it, which is providing a huge amount of resistance. Now, compare this to a liquid-cooled engine. A liquid-cooled engine uses a water pump, which provides virtually no resistance to the rotation of the engine. Now, when you're building a high-performance scooter, you can actually get rid of that manual water pump that runs off the crank and even run an electric water pump, which obviously is even less drag again, which this you really can't do with an air-cooled scooter. So if you're wanting to build something that's going to be a really snappy, aggressively accelerating scooter, you really need something that's water-cooled, because unfortunately the resistance to the rapid acceleration of the engine that an air-cooled scooter has is not really going to be conducive to that sort of a build. Now, moving along to the Minarelli engine. The Minarelli engine is obviously synonymous with Yamaha. Now, this is the base engine that Yamaha have used in pretty much all of their 50cc two-stroke engines since they started making them. The Minarelli engine, like the Honda, was also available early on in a vertical engine. This one was most commonly used in the BWS 50 overseas. In Australia, we got the Yamaha Zuma. Really fun little scooter, really lightweight, really fun to tune. Now, unfortunately, likewise with the Honda engine, the vertical engine does have some limitations in that the set out of it is a little bit tricky because it's a little bit condensed and packed in. And the cylinder kit options available for it likewise are slightly limited. When it comes to the horizontal engine is, if you're looking for top performance, really where it's at with the Minarelli engine. Now, the Minarelli is really one of the best 50cc two-stroke engines ever made as it comes to performance. Now, the horizontal Minarelli engine was available in air-cooled and liquid-cooled. The air-cooled probably most popular in Yamaha models like the Jog, which is a really great fun scooter to tune, primarily because, particularly in the early models, the chassis is so lightweight because you're dragging so much less bike along with it. Even small performance increases made a really big difference, and it really became a bit of a cult favorite with scooter tuners. Now, when it comes to the liquid-cooled Minarelli, this became most synonymous in the Yamaha Aerox. If you're going to say there's a top 3 50cc scooters of all time to tune, the Aerox is definitely number 1 or 2. It's because it responds so well to performance parts. Now, likewise, as I mentioned earlier, better models being having more parts available. Because the Aerox is one of the favorite scooters to tune, there are so many performance parts available from virtually all of the performance parts manufacturers that you can really, it's one of the builds that you can take from, 5 or 6 horsepower all the way up to 50 plus if you really want to go to the absolute limit with, twin cylinder kits available and all sorts of crazy stuff. Because it responds so well, it's really been taken to the extreme as it pertains to the performance parts that are available for them. Now, I would be remiss if I did not mention at this point what we refer to as the CPI engine. Now, CPI, one of the really popular Chinese manufacturers of scooters overseas, because some of the Chinese manufacturers change names and are rebranded as different things all over the place, it can be a little bit hard to track. But if you have a Chinese manufactured 50cc two-stroke engine, 99% of the time, you're going to have a Minarelli copy engine. Now, CPI have modified the Minarelli engine slightly by increasing the size of the gudgeon pin to 12mm as opposed to 10mm, more commonly used in the Yamahas. And the CPI engine also has a slightly larger crank spline. Now, other than this, the CPI engine and the Minarelli engine are basically exactly the same. They share many parts, including belts. The variator is slightly different, obviously, because of the increased crank spline. But the cylinder, you could take a Yamaha Jog cylinder kit, for instance, put a 12mm piston in it and bolt it directly into one of these Chinese scooters. Now, because of this, it means that, oddly, many of these lower quality, cheaper Chinese models actually have quite a bit of performance tuning potential. Now, if you can get past some of the quality issues, as it pertains particularly to the chassis, and some of the engine parts are often manufactured to a low quality standard, depending on the model. You can get past some of these, you can actually build yourself quite a quick little scooter out of one of these cheaper Chinese models. Now, moving down the line to the Marini engine, the third in the line. So this is another Italian designed engine. It's been around since sort of about the same time as the Minarelli. And this has been most commonly used in scooter manufacturers such as TGB, Pegasus, Suzuki, and some of the early Aprilias. Now, the Marini was never available in a vertical. It's always been horizontal, but it has been available in both air-cooled and liquid-cooled models. Now, I do have to mention with the Marini, though it is, I would probably describe it a moderate to lower high-end tuning ability as an engine. It unfortunately does really commonly suffer from crank or crank bearing failure. Now, unfortunately, for whatever the reason, the Marini engine in pretty much all of its iterations has really commonly suffered from the left-hand crank bearing failure. Now, I have some different speculations as to why this is. Potentially it's because the left-hand side of the crankshaft is quite a bit longer than many other models of scooters. For whatever the reason, they do unfortunately suffer from crank bearing failure very commonly. This is not to say this can't be gotten around. I myself have owned a Aprilia Ditec, which had the Marini base engine that suffered from crank bearing failure. And we installed a Malossi high compression crankshaft and some really high-end crank bearings. And it did 25,000 plus Ks after that and never had an issue. And have seen similar customer scooters with this same thing. Replace the crank with a good high-quality crank as well as the crank bearings. And then they didn't have this issue again later. One of the great things, moving to positives with the Marini engine, is they do tend to be really torquey down low. Really great for popping wheelies and the sort. and they do respond quite well to performance parts. There's quite a number of performance cylinder kits and exhausts available for them. Not a lot in the really high-end range, but for a mid-range build, they can be really great and really fun scooter to tune up and ride, and it is a relatively simple engine to work on as well. Now, one of the most common variations of the Meridi engine was, as I mentioned earlier, used in the Aprilia Ditec. Now, we have done a whole big breakdown video on the Ditec before that you can see on our channel, which is really in-depth and explains the whole system. But essentially, this was a liquid-cooled, fuel-injected engine, although it did come in an air-cooled variation as well. And unfortunately, suffered a lot of failures because of the complicated electrical system associated with the injection system. So bring it home with the fourth engine type. This is the Piaggio Hyper 2. Now, this is my personal favorite engine, probably a favorite engine of the shop. Now, this engine is found in virtually every Piaggio and Piaggio associated brand scooter available. So this is obviously Piaggio and a few other different brands. They own Aprilia, they own Derby, they own Vespa. And so they use this Hyper 2 engine in all of their umbrellaed brands. Now, I believe one of the reasons that the Hyper 2 does tend to be a bit of a favourite compared to the other three types of engines is that the Hyper 2 is the newest design, having been first introduced in about 1999, whereas the other models of engines are quite a bit older than that and have been around for quite a bit longer. Now, because of this, the technology in the Hyper 2 is quite a bit better, and it does tend to be a really nicely set out, simple engine to work on. And because they are used across all of the Piaggio umbrellaed brands, it means that parts are so readily available for them. And it also created quite a big incentive for the performance parts manufacturers to make a lot of parts for them. Because the engine is so widely available, they know that if they introduce, say for instance, a new cylinder kit for it, it'll be applicable to a lot of scooters. Now, the Hyper 2 comes in a few different variations, and they are all horizontal. It was never available in a vertical option. Now, these different variations are 3 different casing lengths to suit different wheel sizes, and it also comes in an air and a liquid-cooled variation. You may have seen on our channel and in our store, we refer to these 3 different Piaggio casing lengths as the short, the mid, and the long. Now, to put it simply, if you have a large wheel, it's probably going to be the long casing. If you have a small wheel, it's going to be the short, and there are a few models that use the mid casing length. It does get a little bit tricky because there are models that have a 12-inch wheel that use the long, and there are other models that have a 13-inch wheel that use the mid. So it's best just to check with the specific model that you have to make sure that you're ordering the right parts. Now, really the only difference between them in terms of parts that you might order, the diff gearing is going to be different. Obviously, different wheel size, different diff gearing, and also the belt length. There are the 3 different belt lengths corresponding to the 3 different models. Pretty much the rest of the engine is exactly the same. Now, air and liquid cooled, this one's a little bit easier with the Piaggio because there were really only a few models that came in liquid cooling. This is the Aprilia SR50R, the Piaggio NRG, some of the Derby models as well were available in liquid cooled. To the best of my knowledge, none of the Vespas were available in liquid cooling in that 50cc engine. Basically, everything else is air-cooled. Now, one of the interesting things about the Piaggio liquid cooling is between the air and the liquid-cooled models, they share exactly the same engine casing. So, in fact, if you have an air-cooled model and you split the casing apart, you'll see that all the channeling for the impeller and the coolant are still present on the air-cooled model. Now, the great thing about this is if you have an air-cooled Piaggio engine, you can very easily convert it to liquid cooling. In fact, we have done it before here at the shop. It is a bit of a process, but obviously the benefits are massive between air and liquid cooling. This is something that's really unique to the Piaggio engine, and a little bit clever of Piaggio to have made their engine casing moulding simpler and also given people who own the engine the ability to convert from air to liquid cooling. Now, building on that, models such as the Zip SP, which I forgot to mention earlier with the liquid-cooled models, share exactly the same chassis as the air-cooled model. Just means if you're a little bit clever, you can use factory Piaggio parts or aftermarket parts for the Zip SP and bolt them to your air-cooled Zip and convert it completely to liquid cooling in quite a simple manner. Now, one other Piaggio Hyper 2 engine variation I should mention is the Euro 5 models. So this engine will be found in bikes and made from 2020 onwards. And this engine was modified specifically to meet stricter Euro 5 emissions controls. So there's a couple of ways that they've done this. the engine has a different ignition setup, so different stator, different CDI. It also has a different carby as well. And the reason for this is there's two ways of trying to get around the emission standard. One of them is via a little air solenoid that controls an additional air line that goes to the carby that has the ability to open and close and lean the mixture of the carby out as the engine is running. And it also has the ability to adjust the ignition timing to advance or retard the timing. So if the engine is running cool, it will advance the timing. This creates more power. It also burns more fuel, which means it has less emissions. Now, it has a heat sensor on the head. So as the engine temperature increases, it starts to get to a dangerous level. The CDI CDI ECU has the ability to back off the advanced timing and also close the air solenoid, which richens the mixture in the carby to allow the engine to cool down. Now, it'll do this continuously on the fly. Now, we have done videos about this before because it does present some difficulties as it pertains to tuning the engine. You realistically need to keep that factory head with the heat sensor to avoid potentially doing some heat damage. The other alternative is replacing the ECU with a MOSI ECU, which just reduces those parameters for the advanced timing down a little bit. And there are also ways of blocking off the air system in the carby to keep it running at that slightly richer mixture all the time consistently. There are ways of working around it, but if you're looking for a really, really high-powered top-end build, you probably shouldn't go for one of the Euro 5 models. So to summarize, what is the best scooter to tune? I probably list them off as the SR50R, number one in the Euro 4. It doesn't have that Euro 5 system as being the number one. That's if you can't get a Zipp SP, which unfortunately we never got in Australia. The advantage with the Zipp SP is it's a lot lighter than the SR50, but has the same engine. So you have the same tuning capacity and ability, but on a scooter that weighs sort of 20 kilos less, which means obviously you're going to have a bit better power to weight. And the Zipp also has a shorter wheelbase, so it's going to be a bit more fun for doing things like wheel stands and that sort of thing. It's going to be a bit more twitchy if you like that sort of thing. If you want something that's going to be really super stable to ride, the SR50 is going to be it with that longer wheelbase and the bigger wheels. Number two is going to be the Yamaha Aerox. Now, some people who are big Aerox fans might say, no, yeah, Aerox is number one. Well, the reason I put the Aerox at probably number two is because Aerox is getting a little bit older. The really good examples of a liquid-cooled 50cc Aerox, because it did come at a 100cc model as well, they're starting to age a little bit. So if you were looking to buy one as a project bike, you're probably going to need to do a fair bit of maintenance to bring the bike back up to spec before you start doing performance tuning. It's no good putting a bunch of performance parts on a bike and then something silly like the water pump fails and you seize your piston and have to start again. So it's going to be pretty hard with the age of those bikes to get a really good example that you're just going to be able to jump a whole bunch of really good parts on straight away, compared to the SR50, which in its best iteration, the Euro 4, was made all the way up to 2019. Number three is going to be the good old Piaggio Zipp, the air-cooled Zipp. As I mentioned, it can be converted to liquid-cooled, but even in the air-cooled model, there's such a great little package. They handle really nicely, and there's so many performance parts available for them. Even in an air-cooled setup, you can get a really fast, really fun performing bike with not a lot of money spent. And even with the air-cooled, you can still go for sort of a moderate high-end to race setup if you're careful with keeping your cylinder temperatures down and get everything tuned up nicely. Now, I've pretty much only discussed engines in this video. One thing that you need to consider, which I sort of alluded to with the Aerox, is the chassis itself. What parts are available for the chassis? And the big one is, if you break something, are there parts available readily and cheaply? Now, some of the Chinese scooters I mentioned earlier with the different variation of the Minarelli engine, though you can potentially get some good power out of them, the rest of the chassis tends to leave them behind. And although the engine itself is based on Minarelli, a lot of them have a slightly different stator or a slightly different CDI. And because a lot of them are coming out at different times from different manufacturers, it means that sometimes one scooter might have a slightly different variation than another, and it can be really hard to get parts like stators that will fit the bike. Now, this is where it starts to bode really well for Piaggio as well, because the Hyper 2 engine being so simple, parts like stators and CDIs, with the exception of the newer Euro 5, they use the same stator in every model, whether it's a Vespa S50 or an Aprilia SR50R, same stator, same CDI, same carby. Many of them share the same airboxes, same crank. There's really only a couple of differences between the models, such as obviously liquid cooling and air cooling, but the belt and the diff gearing. Pretty much everything else is the same. So you know that if you're buying a project bike, if it's a Piaggio, you're going to have no problems getting parts for it whatsoever, and pretty much the sky's the limit if you're ready to churn it up and have a bit more fun with it. Thanks for watching, guys. We appreciate your support. That one was a little bit information dense, but hopefully you got something good out of it. Have any questions, please let us know. We'll be happy to answer in the comments.